gamble on a tragic prospect of an endless war in Ukraine. It refuses to engage in good faith in negotiations and is pursuing the same maximalist objective as it did at the start of the conflict, despite months of discussions, in particular with the United States. Russia is betting on the exhaustion of Ukraine and its partners, but it is mistaken. On the front line, Russian forces are going nowhere or even retreating in the face of Ukrainian armed forces. Our support for Ukraine will not waver either, because what is at stake here is the defense of international law, the Charter of the United Nations, and the defense of Europe as a whole. Our course here, Mr. President, is clear: continuing legitimate support for Ukraine, which is courageously defending itself, maintaining necessary pressure, particularly economic pressure on Russia. Our determination remains intact. We can see that through the interception on the Mediterranean on Friday by the French Navy of a vessel belonging to Russia's shadow fleet involved in financing Moscow's war effort and posing additional risk to coastal states. Almost 1 year to the day after Ukraine accepted in Jeddah, on the request of the United States, an immediate unconditional ceasefire, we call on Russia to finally accept for itself the same ceasefire that it proposed for the Middle East. The UN Secretary General, the vast majority of member states from all continents, and the resolution adopted by the General Assembly on the 24th of February this year have all unambiguously called for this. Mr. President, France supports negotiations, and we invite Russia to take up this offer in good faith on the initiative of the United States to stop the fighting rather than trying to prolong it through stalling tactics that have gone on too long. We support these peace efforts. We stand ready for dialogue in good faith, just as we stand ready to guarantee Ukraine's security in the long term with the coalition of the willing. We will continue to work with our partners to reach a just and lasting settlement to this conflict, that is, a settlement that respects the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. Je vous remercie. And I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Deputy Secretary Landau, I thank you for your presence here today, highlighting the seriousness of the situation. I also thank USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher for their comprehensive remarks. And I welcome the participation of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has now entered its 5th year, and attacks are continuing. During another winter of war, Russia continued to relentlessly attack civilians and civilian infrastructure. Only during last month, schools, public buses, residential buildings, and railway infrastructure were among the targets, while casualties, including children, continue to steadily rise by more than 30% compared to the same period last year. Greece reiterates its absolute condemnation of these attacks and its unwavering solidarity and support to the Ukrainian people. Any targeting of civilians violates the most fundamental tenets of international humanitarian law and should cease immediately. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East should not divert our focus and attention from Ukraine. The bloodshed needs to stop now. This is the will of the overwhelming majority of the international community, as repeatedly enshrined in multiple General Assembly resolutions, including the most recent one adopted in February. We also call on Russia to cooperate on the safe return of the Ukrainian children in line with the General Assembly resolution adopted last December. We stress the findings of the latest report of the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, concluding that deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children, as well as their enforced disappearance, along with other serious violations of human rights, attest to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Mr. President, Greece has supported the US-led peace efforts and the bilateral engagement between Ukraine and Russia and welcomes its latest outcome, namely the exchange of more than 1,000 prisoners of war at the beginning of this month. We also support the next steps of this engagement to achieve peace, but not just any peace. As a staunch proponent of international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter, we remain committed to the principles of sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of all states, rejecting any change of borders through the use of force. We emphasize that no peace agreement can be sustainable without the full consent of Ukraine, and we stress the need for credible and enforceable security guarantees to deter future aggression. That is the only way forward for Ukraine and the only way to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Greece stands with the people of Ukraine and will continue to support a sovereign, prosperous, democratic, and European future for Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome to the Security Council, Deputy Secretary Landau. I also thank USG's DiCarlo and Fletcher for their briefing, and I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine and other countries of the region in our meeting. Colleagues, it is over 4 years since Russia launched its illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in direct violation of the UN Charter. It is a war that demands this Council's sustained attention. In February, Russia fired 280 missiles at Ukraine, the highest monthly total of the entire war. And since 28 February, Russia has fired over 3,200 drones at Ukraine. This is roughly as many as Iran, who supplied so many of these drones to Russia, has fired at all its neighbours combined in the same period. Russia is now firing over 5,000 drones per month at Ukraine, 5 times higher than in 2024. The burden on Ukrainian civilians is immense. There have been over 50,000 Ukrainian civilian casualties and over 15,000 killed since Russia started its war. Waves of attacks on its electricity and heating infrastructure in the depths of winter. Russia has also sought to systematically erase Ukrainian identity, including through the forcible deportation and indoctrination of thousands of Ukrainian children. Acts that earlier this month, the Independent Commission of Inquiry concluded constitute crimes against humanity. Russia could end this war today. We repeat this because it remains true. Ukraine agreed in principle to a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire 12 months ago. If Russia is serious about peace, we call upon it to agree the same and to engage in meaningful negotiations towards a just and lasting peace. Ukraine remains committed to US-led diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace, in line with the UN Charter. But in return, Russia has only dragged out talks, issued ultra-maximalist demands, and intensified its assaults. Mr. President, the UK fully supports the diplomatic efforts of our US colleagues to secure a peace that guarantees Ukraine's long-term security, sovereignty, and prosperity. We call on Russia to end its war of choice, immediately and without preconditions. The UK will not cease in our support for Ukraine and its people. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President,
Не надо быть семи пядей во лбу
you don't have to be particularly clever,
или проницательным аналитиком,
nor do you have to be an insightful analyst to understand why the Ukrainian regime and its European accomplices
запросили сегодняшнее
requested
заседание.
today's meeting.
Zelensky
is literally flabbergasted by the spotlight shifting from Ukraine and his own heroic persona over to the situation surrounding the escalation in the Middle East, a situation which objectively needs the close attention of the international community. The regime in Kiev is no longer in the limelight, and it's desperately trying to become the center of attention again. Yet the second-rate actor from Kryvyi Rih, that is Zelensky, couldn't not seize the opportunity to try and get some dividends from the tragic events transpiring in the Middle East. Zelensky sprung into action immediately. He began offering his assistance, talking about how he's sending Ukrainian military specialists and drone calculations to places thousands of kilometers away to defend foreign bases and to participate in foreign conflicts. Instead of showing concern for his own people, his own country, he's trying to remind his Western sponsors of how useful he is at any cost. Otherwise, God forbid, the money he's regularly pocketed and put into the pockets of his associates will flow from Ukraine to the Gulf, which is far from Ukraine. Clearly, today, what's more important for Kiev today is to be involved in any war rather than seek a path to peace back home. That's why he's on a world tour, going to Europe, to the US, begging for financial and military assistance, trying to create the illusion of seeking peace, putting forward demands, and the way he sees it, or rather hallucinates it, so-called fair conditions, an immediate ceasefire, a return to 1991 borders, the deployment of foreign military contingents on Ukrainian territory, and so on and so forth. Mr. President, the Western members of the Security Council speak of supposedly growing numbers of Russian strikes on Ukrainian territory, and yet in European capitals and in Brussels, that is in the EU, they are all turning a blind eye to all Ukrainian armed forces crimes, continuing to provide comprehensive support to Kiev. Mr. President, a few words about European beacons of democracy. European countries are undertaking desperate steps to silence everyone who's telling the truth about the situation in Ukraine. Using trumped-up pretexts, they are introducing restrictions on their own fellow citizens. Why are they doing this? Because these citizens have interpretations and views which are not in line with the official line of the EU or of specific Western states. These include the German bloggers Alina Lipp and Thomas Reppe, the French national Adrien Bocquet, the Swiss national Jacques Bod, and the Brit Graham Phillips. There's been no due process. They've been accused of disinformation, propaganda, and destabilizing activities. Aforementioned persons might be familiar to the Security Council from ARIA formula meetings. This is nothing but intimidation. It's scare tactics. Persecution of dissidents has become common currency in Europe, whereas freedom of speech and the presumption of innocence are now empty words. At the same time, Kiev's terrorist attacks are not abating. On the contrary, they're on the rise. On the 10th of March, French and British long-range storm shadows struck the city of Bryansk. The targeted strike hit a bustling business district located right next to residential houses containing multiple apartments, a children's goods store, several of them in fact, a university, and other civilian infrastructure. As a result, 8 people died and over 40 were wounded. On that very same day, the Ukrainian armed forces attacked, using drones, a medical facility in the Donetsk People's Republic. During the attack, over 130 patients and roughly 50 medics were in the building. 10 medics died, 10 more people received wounds of varying levels of severity. On the whole, in the week between the 19th to the 15th of March, due to strikes and shelling by Ukrainian Nazis, 239 civilians suffered. 202 people were wounded, including 6 children, and 37 were killed. Almost 3,500 rounds of ammunition hit civilian objects. We're seeing an unprecedented number of attacks using drones, attacks targeting Russian regions, including Moscow and the Moscow Oblast. On the whole, since February of 2022, at least 27,500 Russian civilians suffered as a result of Ukrainian armed forces attacks. Over 520 social facilities, 174 educational facilities, and 74 health facilities were destroyed in the Belgorod Oblast alone. And in the Belgorod Oblast alone, 467 people died. Of them, 23 were children. Ukrainian armed forces are literally hunting down these live targets using drones. Civilians are regularly being targeted. This is a deliberate tactic being deployed by the Kiev regime. Right now, everyone is concerned by the situation surrounding the Hormuz Strait and the prospects of ensuring supply from the Persian Gulf. Let us remind you that the Security Council never did condemn the terrorist attacks against the Nord Stream pipelines, which are a major artery for transporting natural gas to Europe. Almost 4 years have gone by since those attacks, yet we still have not gotten the results of the investigation. Attacks are also continuing on other export infrastructure, which supplies Russian gas via Turk Stream and Blue Stream. In the last few days alone, there were drone attacks attempted on the Ruskaya compressor station in the Krasnodarsk region, as well as the Kazachia and Beregovaya stations. These irresponsible actions are occurring at a time when global energy markets are acutely unstable, not to mention the Ukrainians blocking the Druzhba oil pipeline, which patently demonstrates the fact that Kiev intends to use infrastructure as a way of exercising pressure, a political play. Previously, you, Europeans, groundlessly accused Russia of engaging in energy blackmail. But when Ukraine does this, and when there are grounds for us to say this, the response is silence. That's something entirely different, you say. Kiev's reckless actions are on par with the terrorist attacks on Russian and foreign tankers in the international waters of the Mediterranean and Black Seas, which Kiev has sanctioned. Is anyone on the Security Council interested in the freedom and safety of merchant shipping in this context? Anyone? Mr. President, it's increasingly obvious that the current Ukrainian authorities are interested in neither peace talks nor in the most basic humanitarian steps which could alleviate people's suffering. And that can be seen not in words, but in the concrete deeds of Ukraine, or rather the lack thereof. Here's a simple example. In the city of Suma, to date, there are 7 civilians detained, people who were forcibly taken from the Kursk Oblast. These aren't servicemen, they're non-combatants. They're regularly civilians who are being held hostage by Kiev's lawlessness. Yet when discussing prisoner exchanges, the Ukrainians, first and foremost, are insisting on the return of radical militants belonging to the Azov Nationalist Battalion. Meanwhile, the fate of ordinary mobilized men, who frequently end up at the front against their will, well, that comes second. This is eloquently demonstrated. This eloquently demonstrates where Kiev's priorities lie. It's no longer possible to conceal the way the mobilization is proceeding in Ukraine. It can be concealed neither by loud pronouncements nor rhetoric abroad. The systemic, large-scale and coercive campaign looks less and less like mobilization as we know it. It's increasingly turning into a hunt for humans. Images disseminated via social media speak for themselves. Draft office staff are literally kidnapping people in the streets. They're snatching them in their places of work, dragging them off public transport. And at the same time, the so-called system of exemptions, which is supposed to protect certain categories of specialists from being drafted, well, in practice, that system has become a corruption filter. Those who have money or connections are safe. The rest are sent off to the front. All of the above creates a dangerous divide within society, whereby some are seen as a higher caste of sorts, whereas others are expendable. And this is not just a moral issue, it's a strategic dead end. After all, an army built on coercion and fear cannot be combat ready. Against this backdrop, it's understandable why the upper echelons of power in Kiev fear real talks. A serious diplomatic process will inevitably ask, why were so many people sacrificed? Why weren't the opportunities for settlement seized upon? The President of the Russian Federation repeatedly reaffirmed that we are unequivocally committed to a negotiated solution and to achieving the goals of a special military operation via diplomatic methods. However, since the Kiev regime is not ready for this, since egged on by its European friends, Kiev intends to continue fighting at any cost, well, Kiev will soon have to face new conditions for a settlement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
President, Deputy Secretary of State, we welcome you presiding over this session. And I would also like to thank USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher for their briefings. The conflict in Ukraine, now in its 5th year, has exacted a heavy cost on all those affected. Peoples, their livelihoods, economies, entire countries, entire regions, and beyond. Its prolonged nature has deepened divisions, strained multilateralism, and complicated efforts towards a peaceful resolution. The humanitarian dimension in particular is tragic. As highlighted in the 2 briefings, civilians continue to bear the brunt of hostilities, with loss of life, displacement, and destruction of homes and infrastructure. The continued human suffering underscores the urgent need to uphold human dignity, ensure protection of civilians, and prioritize a peaceful settlement of this conflict. President, from the very first days of this conflict, Pakistan has stood on the side of dialogue and diplomacy. And we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this conflict, and that a just and lasting peace can only be achieved through sustained, structured, and meaningful dialogue. We advocated our support for dialogue in 2022 when the 2 sides engaged in Istanbul, and we have continued to support all subsequent peace initiatives, including Security Council Resolution 2774 of February last year, and the ongoing negotiation process facilitated by the United States. Regrettably, the unfolding of another totally avoidable crisis in the Middle East has also interrupted the negotiation process on Ukraine. We, however, hope that the next round of these negotiations would take place at the earliest, and that all parties would continue their efforts for peace, demonstrate genuine political will, build mutual understanding, and engage constructively to achieve a negotiated settlement of the conflict, beginning with an immediate cessation of hostilities. Bringing a lasting peace would require firm commitment to the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, and a focus on finding a mutually acceptable solution that corresponds to the respective positions and legitimate security interests of all sides. Pakistan will continue to support all initiatives aimed at bridging the divides and promoting pacific settlement of conflicts globally, Ukraine or elsewhere, always upholding international law and in full respect of the UN Charter principles. Pakistan therefore reiterates its call for restraint, de-escalation, and the resolution of all disputes through dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Mr. President, Liberia welcomes you and thanks the briefers for their sobering updates. As we have heard, we meet today against the backdrop of a conflict whose humanitarian consequences continue to deepen, particularly through the widespread destruction of infrastructure essential to civilian survival. The destruction of energy systems, water networks, and basic services, especially under winter conditions, has compounded the vulnerability of millions and underscores the urgency of a more focused and outcome-oriented response from this Council. Liberia calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to act in full compliance with their obligations under international law. At the same time, the Security Council continues to engage this issue with notable regularity, including through monthly meetings. While such sustained attention is necessary, Liberia observes that this consistency of engagement has yet to translate at scale into measurable progress toward a cessation of hostilities, nor has it yielded a clearly articulated and credible pathway toward peace. We raise this observation mindful of the complexity of the situation, but also conscious that the Council must continually assess whether its methods of engagement are aligned with the objective of influencing outcomes on the ground. In this regard, Liberia is of the view that the Council must guard against a situation where it remains actively seized of the matter in form, but less effective in advancing conditions for resolution in substance. The value of our engagement must ultimately be measured by its contribution to de-escalation and to a viable political horizon. Against this backdrop, Liberia wishes to highlight several considerations. The protection of civilians must remain paramount. Previous speakers have made this point, and over the last 4 years continue to do so. Attacks affecting infrastructure indispensable to civilian survival, including energy, water, and healthcare systems, should be assessed not only in isolation, but in light of their cumulative and cascading humanitarian impact. All parties must fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, including with respect to the treatment of prisoners of war. In this regard, Liberia notes with concern issues raised in recent briefings, including serious concerns highlighted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Such matters, where substantiated, must be addressed through appropriate and impartial processes consistent with international law. Reports of violations affecting civilians and detained persons further underscore the importance of upholding accountability and reinforcing the normative framework governing armed conflict. At the same time, the Council's engagement must increasingly be guided by the imperative of achieving tangible progress. Liberia encourages the identification of practical, incremental steps that can contribute to de-escalation and help build confidence toward a broader political resolution. Closely linked to this is the need to advance a realistic and clearly defined pathway toward peace, as the absence of such a framework continue to risk leaving ongoing efforts reactive rather than strategic. Liberia also believes it will be a matter of concern if the Council were to conclude its engagement on this issue, having maintained it on the agenda without demonstrable movement toward a resolution. Sustained attention must translate into meaningful impact. We further note, with concern, reports regarding the movement and relocation of children in the context of the conflict. This is an issue that warrants continued attention and careful examination in future briefings, given its serious humanitarian and legal implications. In conclusion, Mr. President, Liberia remains convinced that there is no military solution to this conflict. We therefore support renewed diplomatic engagement aimed at achieving a much-needed ceasefire and a political settlement consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. We encourage this Council to match the regularity of its engagement with a renewed emphasis on strategic direction and measurable outcomes. A Council that meets consistently must also move the needle, because being seized of a matter is not, in itself, a substitute for progress toward peace. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
secrétaire d'État adjoint des États-Unis d'Amérique, Christopher Orlando,
Deputy Secretary of State, a very warm welcome. The Democratic Republic of the Congo welcomes the calling of this meeting, which allows us to continue our exchanges on the situation in Ukraine in light of recent developments. We'd like to thanks to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and Mr. Tom Fletcher, respectively, USG for Political and Peace-Building Affairs and USG for Humanitarian Affairs. Thank you for your briefings. Mr. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo remains deeply disquieted by the ongoing hostilities and the dramatic consequences they're having for civilians. As we highlighted during our previous intervention, the deterioration of the humanitarian situation reminds us that behind these conflict dynamics are first and foremost human lives, families, entire communities who've been plunged into suffering. It's absolutely necessary to put an end to the hostilities and to ensure strict respect for all commitments to a ceasefire. Indeed, only an effective cessation of fighting will help reduce the suffering of civilian populations on a lasting basis and prevent an exacerbation of the humanitarian situation. On this note, although there haven't been any concrete improvements on the ground, the DRC nonetheless notes with great interest encouraging signals we saw in mid-February, signals which point to a resumption of diplomatic efforts. We therefore urge all parties to opt for the path of dialogue and to double their efforts to consolidate an effective, lasting and credible ceasefire. Mr. President, respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians should remain unstinting priorities in times of conflict. On this note, the DRC recalls the need to guarantee safe, rapid and unfettered humanitarian access to all people in need. Humanitarian actors should be able to intervene under appropriate security conditions so as to effectively meet the pressing needs of the populations in question. We further reiterate our deep disquiet about attacks targeting civilian infrastructure, in particular energy facilities, the deterioration of which directly affects people's living conditions and compromises their access to essential services. Mr. President, the DRC would like to recall that this conflict is also still having ramifications far beyond this particular theatre. Indeed, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is aggravating existing economic and food insecurity, which is weighing very heavily on the most fragile populations. In particular, this situation is contributing to the disruption in grains, supply chains, and basic necessity supply chains, which is disproportionately affecting African countries which rely heavily on imports. Mr. President, by way of conclusion, the Democratic Republic of the Congo remains committed to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, specifically the peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of states. We remain convinced that a genuinely just and lasting peace can only be achieved by exploring diplomatic pathways, which fully take into account the root causes of the crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the DRC for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher for their briefings. The protracted crisis in Ukraine is something that no party, including China, wishes to see. Since the beginning of this year, intensive dialogues on the Ukraine issue have taken place, which China welcomes. The negotiating table is the starting point for peace, although the current momentum of talks has slowed. So long as dialogue continues, a solution will be found, and the door to peace will be opened. Since the outbreak of the crisis, China has consistently promoted peace talks and worked for a political settlement of the crisis. The four shoulds put forward by President Xi Jinping constitute the fundamental guidance for China's position on the Ukraine issue. We believe that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. In light of the latest developments, China wishes to stress the following. First, it is important to ensure the equal participation of all sides and strike a solid foundation for peace. The protracted crisis has become what it is today for a variety of complex reasons that involve multiple stakeholders. China supports the participation of all parties and stakeholders in the peace process. Seeking common ground while setting aside differences through dialogue and building consensus through negotiations so as to jointly advance a political settlement and achieve lasting peace. Second, it is important to accommodate the legitimate concerns of all sides and enhance the will for peace. Russia and Ukraine are neighbors that cannot be moved away. What is needed is goodwill instead of hostility, and mutual respect instead of confrontation. China encourages both sides to proceed from the fundamental and long-term interests of their peoples, accommodate each other's legitimate concerns, and strive to reach a comprehensive, durable, and binding peace agreement at an early date. Third, it is important to realize common security and build a lasting architecture of peace. The Ukraine crisis is essentially a major outbreak of security tensions in Europe, resulting from the long-standing accumulation and deterioration of security and trust deficits. Parties concerned should draw lessons from the crisis, uphold the principle of indivisible security, and work towards building a balanced, effective, and sustainable regional security framework so as to achieve lasting peace and stability in Europe. President, there are no winners in a war conflict. Military means can never bring lasting peace. An early ceasefire and a political settlement represent the only viable path forward. China will continue to uphold an objective and impartial position, remain committed to promoting peace and dialogue, maintain communication with relevant parties, and work tirelessly toward a political settlement of the crisis. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
que nos distinga Su
We
Excelencia
are very grateful
al
to Your
presidir
Excellency
esta reunión.
for honoring us by
Acogemos
presiding
con
over this meeting.
atención las palabras de la señora
We
Rosemary DiCarlo,
welcome the
Secretaria
words
General Adjunta,
of Ms. Rosemary
y
DiCarlo,
respaldamos
Undersecretary General,
nuevamente
and we
su
once
firme
again
llamado a un alto
support
al fuego
her
inmediato
firm call for an
como
immediate
paso
ceasefire
esencial
as an
para
essential
aliviar
step to
el
easing
sufrimiento
the
de la
suffering
población
of the
civil
civilian
y
population
avanzar
and
hacia
advancing
una
towards
solución
a
pacífica
peaceful
de este
settlement to this
conflicto.
conflict.
Asimismo, agradecemos al
Further,
señor Tom
we
Fletcher,
thank Mr. Tom
Secretario
Fletcher,
General
Under
Adjunto
Secretary
de
General
Asuntos
for
Humanitarios
Humanitarian
y
Affairs
Coordinador
and
del Socorro de
Emergency
Emergencia,
Relief Coordinator,
por su detallada
for
y
his
puntual
detailed
exposición sobre la
briefing
situación
on
en
the
el terreno.
situation on the ground.
Reconocemos la asistencia de las
We
distinguidas
recognize the
delegaciones
presence
que
of
nos
distinguished
acompañan en sala.
delegations joining us in the chamber
Panamá
today.
observa con profunda preocupación
Panama notes with profound
cómo la
concern
actual
how the
superposición de
current
conflictos en
overlapping
un contexto
conflicts
geopolítico
in an
cada vez más
increasingly
volátil
volatile
compromete la
geopolitical
capacidad de
context
respuesta
is
de la
compromising
comunidad
the international
internacional
community's
y de
ability
este
to
Consejo y
respond,
además
as
genera
well as the ability
consecuencias
of this Council
devastadoras
to respond,
para
and
los
is having
civiles,
devastating
quienes en su
consequences
gran mayoría
for
terminan
civilians, the
soportando
vast
el peso
majority
de
of
los
whom end up
enfrentamientos.
bearing the brunt of the violence.
Esta preocupante tendencia
This
global
worrisome
se
global
refleja en el
trend
contexto
can
de
be
Ucrania,
seen in the
donde la
context of
crisis
Ukraine,
humanitaria
in which the
continúa
humanitarian crisis
deteriorándose de manera
continues to
sostenida.
worsen apace.
Según informes de Naciones
According
Unidas,
to
el uso
United Nations
creciente de
reports,
armas
the
de largo
increasing
alcance,
use of
incluidos
long-range
misiles
weapons,
y
including
drones,
missiles and
ha
drones,
incrementado el
has
riesgo para
heightened
la
the risk for
población
the
civil
civilian
y
population,
los ataques
and
a la
attacks on
infraestructura energética
energy infrastructure
han agravado las
have
condiciones
worsened
de
the
vida,
living conditions,
particularmente durante
particularly
este último
over
invierno.
this past winter.
El año 2025
2025
fue el más
was
mortífero
the most
para las
deadly
poblaciones
year
civiles
for
de los
the
beligerantes
civilian populations
desde el inicio de
of
las
the
hostilidades,
belligerents since the
con
beginning
al
of
menos
hostilities, with at
2.514
least
personas fallecidas y más de
2,514 dead
12.000
and
heridas.
more than 12,000
Esto
wounded.
refleja un
This
incremento
reflects an
alarmante del
alarming
31% en las
31% rise
víctimas
in
civiles de las
civilian
partes respecto al
casualties
año anterior.
for the parties year on
Más de
year.
10 millones de personas
More
requieren
than 10
asistencia
million
humanitaria,
people are in need of
mientras que
humanitarian
una cifra
assistance,
similar
while
ha
a
sido
similar figure
desplazada,
has been
incluyendo
displaced, including
3.7 millones de
3.7
desplazados
million
internos
internally
y
displaced
cerca de
and
6
around
millones
6
de
million
refugiados en el
refugees
exterior.
abroad.
Este desplazamiento masivo
This mass
no solo genera
displacement is
presión
not
sobre
only
los países
piling
vecinos,
pressure on
sino
neighboring
que también
countries,
crea
it
condiciones de vulnerabilidad
also
extrema
puts those who
para
are
quienes se ven
forced to
obligados
flee
a
their
abandonar
homes
sus
in a
hogares.
position of extreme
La
vulnerability.
resolución 2774,
Resolution
adoptada en
2774, adopted
2025,
in 2025,
expresa de manera inequívoca
unequivocally
la voluntad de
expresses
este
the will
Consejo
of this Council
como garante de
as
la
the
paz y
guarantor
seguridad
of international
internacionales
peace and
y
security,
reafirma la
and it
necesidad de
reaffirms
poner
the
fin
need
a la
to
guerra de
bring
manera
an immediate
inmediata.
end to the war.
Panamá
Panama
reitera la
reiterates
urgencia de
the
retomar
urgent
con
need
prioridad
to,
los esfuerzos
as a
diplomáticos
priority,
destinados a
resume
poner
the
fin a este
diplomatic
conflicto
efforts to bring
y
an end to
reitera
this
su llamado
conflict.
a que
And
las
we
partes
reiterate our
involucradas
appeal for the parties
mantengan la
involved
voluntad
to
política de
maintain
un
the
diálogo
necessary
constante
political
y
will for a
constructivo
constant and
que bajo los
constructive
principios
dialogue, which,
consagrados en la
under the
Carta de las
principles
Naciones
enshrined in the
Unidas,
UN Charter,
encuentre una
leads
salida
to
definitiva
a
a este
definitive end
prolongado
to this
conflicto.
protracted
Sin
conflict.
esa voluntad
Without
política
this
de
political
ambas
will
partes,
from both
cualquier
sides,
esfuerzo de
any
este Consejo
effort by this
desde una
Council
perspectiva
from
práctica
a
y realista
practical and
será
realistic
inútil.
perspective
Gracias,
will
Presidente.
be worthless. Thank you,
I
President.
thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher for their comprehensive briefing. As this conflict continues, my delegation remains profoundly concerned by the continued deterioration of both security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which have now entered a difficult chapter. The ongoing hostilities serve only to prolong human suffering and further diminish the prospect for a sustainable peace. We are troubled by the continued escalation of military actions affecting civilian and civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, and the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. Somalia reiterates that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and uphold the aforementioned principles without exception. In this spirit, we welcome the significant prisoner of war exchange completed on March 6 between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Such humanitarian milestones serve as essential confidence-building measures and remind us that amidst deep division, cooperation remains possible. Mr. President, we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole viable measures to bring this crisis to an end. In this regard, we note with encouragement the ongoing international diplomatic initiatives and welcome the trilateral talks led by the United States. While the next phase of these talks planned in March have been postponed, we look forward to their resumption to ensure these diplomatic tracks continue their momentum toward a resolution to this conflict. These engagements represent a vital step toward a de-escalation, and we hope they will lay the ground for a constructive and durable path forward. A lasting and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of this conflict and be fully consistent with the purpose and the principles of the United Nations Charter. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability in the region. The Ukrainian people and all those affected by this conflict deserve peace, prosperity, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Por convocar esta sesión.
Thank you for convening this
Extiendo
meeting.
también mi
I
agradecimiento a
also
la
wish to convey my
Secretaria General
thanks
para
to
Asuntos
the
Políticos y
Undersecretary
de
General
Consolidación de
for
Paz de
Political and
Naciones
Peace-Building
Unidas,
Affairs,
así como al Secretario
and
General
the
Adjunto de Asuntos
Undersecretary General
Humanitarios
for
y Coordinador
Humanitarian
del
Affairs
Socorro
and the
de
Emergency
Emergencia de las
Relief
Naciones Unidas
Coordinator.
por sus reportes
I thank them for their
y saludo a
briefings,
las
and
delegaciones
I
que me
greet the
acompañan en la
delegations
sesión
joining
de hoy.
us today.
Nos encontramos ante un conflicto
We are
prolongado
facing a
cuyo
protracted
impacto más
conflict whose
devastador recae
most
de manera
devastating
constante e
impact
inaceptable sobre la
consistently and
población civil.
unacceptably falls on the
El
civilian
balance es
population.
claro y profundamente
The result is clear
desesperanzador.
and deeply distressing.
Vidas perdidas,
Lives lost,
familias
families
desplazadas,
displaced,
comunidades
communities
fracturadas
wrought
y
apart,
generaciones
and entire
enteras
generations
marcadas por la
living in
incertidumbre.
uncertainty.
Las zonas urbanas continúan
Urban
siendo
areas
un escenario
remain
de
a scene of
hostilidades que
hostilities
afectan a la
affecting
población
the
y a la
population
infraestructura
and
crítica
critical
y
infrastructure
indispensable para la
that is
supervivencia
essential to daily
cotidiana.
survival.
Sistema de
That is
energía,
energy,
agua,
water,
salud y
health, and
transporte.
transport systems.
Los ataques contra
Attacks
objetos e
on
infraestructura
civilian objects and
son una amenaza
infrastructure
directa
are a
a la vida
direct
y a la
threat to
dignidad.
life and to dignity.
Hospitales que no pueden operar,
Hospitals unable
escuelas
to operate,
cerradas y
schools
hogares sin
shuttered,
calefacción
and
en pleno
houses
invierno.
without heating
Estas
in the
no
middle of
son
winter.
consecuencias colaterales
These are not
inevitables,
unavoidable
son
collateral
realidades
consequences. They are
inaceptables
unacceptable
que Colombia
realities that
rechaza
Colombia categorically
y que deben
rejects
ser la
and that must
prioridad
be
de
the
este
priority
Consejo.
of this Council.
Además, las
In
violencias
addition,
basadas en género en el contexto
conflict-related
del
gender-based
conflicto,
violence,
incluyendo la
including
violencia
sexual
sexual,
violence,
sigue siendo un motivo
remains
de
the source of
profunda
profound
preocupación.
concern.
Condenamos
We
enfáticamente
roundly
todos
condemn
los
all
actos de esta
acts of this
naturaleza,
nature,
independientemente de quien los
irrespective
cometa.
of the
Y
perpetrators.
recordamos que
And we
constituyen una
recall that they
violación al derecho
represent a
internacional.
violation of international law.
Instamos a todas las partes a
We
prevenir,
urge all
investigar
parties
y
to prevent,
sancionar estos
investigate,
crímenes,
and punish these crimes,
garantizar la
to
protección de las
guarantee
víctimas
protection
y
for victims and
sobrevivientes
survivors,
y asegurar
and
su
ensure
acceso
their
a la
access to
justicia y a la
justice and
rendición de
accountability.
cuentas. Las víctimas civiles de esta guerra no
The
merecen
civilian
más
victims
sufrimiento.
of this war
Es
deserve
urgente
an end to
promover
their
medidas
suffering.
concretas
Concrete
para
steps
atender
are
su
urgently
situación.
needed to address
No
their
podemos
situation.
permitir que la
We cannot
inercia
allow inertia
sustituya
to
a la
replace
responsabilidad.
responsibility.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
es imperativo
it
que
is
todas las partes
imperative for
respeten
all parties
y
to
aseguren el
respect
respeto al
and
derecho
ensure
internacional humanitario.
respect for
Lo
international
anterior incluye
humanitarian
la
law.
obligación de
This includes
garantizar
an
en todo
obligation
momento
to, at all times,
un trato humano y
guarantee
digno a los
humane
prisioneros
and
de guerra,
decent treatment for
asegurando
prisoners of
condiciones
war,
adecuadas de
ensuring
detención,
adequate detention
acceso a
conditions,
asistencia
access
médica,
to medical
contacto
care,
con sus familias
contact with
y
their
prohibición
families, and the
absoluta
absolute
de la
prohibition
tortura
of torture
y de cualquier
and any
forma de
form
trato
of
cruel,
cruel,
inhumano o
inhumane, or
degradante.
degrading treatment.
Al mismo tiempo es
At the same
fundamental
time, it is
impulsar
essential to promote and strengthen channels of dialogue, ensuring that they maintain a continued, predictable momentum that ensures gradual and tangible progress. In this context, Colombia encourages the parties to keep up consistent efforts, and we thank all of the mediators whose work has made it possible to advance towards peace. We call on all of the parties to step up diplomatic efforts and to persevere in their attempts to achieve a serious and verifiable agreement under the principles of good faith and in accordance with the United Nations Charter. History has shown how even in the most complex contexts, dialogue remains the only path to reducing suffering and forging a sustainable and just outcome. At the same time, Colombia would like to underscore the grave danger posed by any escalation around nuclear facilities. The mere possibility of incidents in those areas entails catastrophic risks, not only for Ukraine, but also for the region and the entire world. It's essential to guarantee their security, demilitarization, and adequate technical oversight. Mr. President, it's time to bring an end to this war. Every day that passes without progress towards de-escalation and negotiation is one more day of suffering for thousands of civilians. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me at the outset to welcome Mr. Christopher Landau, Deputy Secretary of State of the United States. I would also like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their briefings to the Council today. Mr. President, armed conflicts are increasingly affecting civilians, leading to human casualties and the destruction of critical infrastructure. This hinders the provision of basic services, including electricity, water, and heating, and impacts the global economy and energy supplies. These conflicts also have a profound psychological toll on civilians. In 2025, the Ukraine-Russia war resulted in the deaths of at least 2,500 civilians and the injury of more than 12,000, the highest figures recorded since the crisis erupted in 2022. In this regard, we wish to address the following 3 points. First, the Kingdom of Bahrain emphasizes the need to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. This entails respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, and fostering good neighborly relations in accordance with Article 2 of the Charter. Second, the Kingdom of Bahrain warns against the excessive use of weapons in conflict, endangering civilian lives and damaging vital civilian infrastructure, particularly given the sharp rise in the use of ballistic missiles and drones recently by any party and in any conflict. The OHCHR has noted a significant increase in civilian casualties resulting from short-range drone attacks. In fact, civilian losses caused by short-range drones rose by 121% in 2025, resulting in the death of 580 civilians. In this context, we wish to note the continued attacks by ballistic missiles and drones launched by the Islamic Republic of Iran against my country, the Kingdom of Bahrain, as well as against the Gulf Cooperation Council states, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and several other countries in the region. The Security Council, in its Resolution 2817 of March 11, 2026, which was co-sponsored by 136 states, strongly condemned these brutal attacks and called upon Iran to immediately seize them. This reflects the international solidarity with our nations in the face of the blatant Iranian aggression that endangers civilian lives and threatens regional and international peace and security. Third, the Kingdom of Bahrain underscores the importance of United States' efforts to facilitate diplomatic negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, as well as the humanitarian and political mediation role played by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the State of Qatar. We look forward to these negotiations yielding tangible results, leading to a peaceful and durable solution to the war in Ukraine. Diplomatic negotiations and dialogue are the only viable path towards security and peace in Europe. In this regard, the Kingdom of Bahrain appreciates all states making an effort to mediate for the sake of security, peace, and stability, and contributing to the de-escalation of crises in an endeavor to find a diplomatic solution. In conclusion, Mr. President, it has become imperative today to support diplomatic efforts to end the war in Ukraine and establish sustainable peace while mitigating its humanitarian repercussions in line with the principles of international law, the UN Charter, and Security Council Resolution 2774. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I wish to thank the U.S. Presidency for convening this meeting and you, Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau, for chairing it. It is a powerful signal that shows the importance that the U.S. government attaches to Ukraine. I'm also grateful to the delegations of Denmark, Greece, Latvia, France, and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukraine's request. I'm further thankful to the distinguished briefers, Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher, for their eye-opening and powerful briefings. I have no doubt that sooner than some may expect, all the shocking facts that we just heard from the UN Secretariat will serve as evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which Russia has been committing during its full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. We commend the indispensable work of the UN institutions in Ukraine and call upon the member states to help finance the humanitarian needs. We all heard an appeal of UN Emergency Relief Coordinator USG Fletcher. Mr. President, before I proceed with my statement, I want to briefly react to the allegations of the representative of Russia about the supposed suffering of Russian people, even though he escaped the chamber. Listening to all those fantasies, one might get an impression that it is Ukraine that invaded poor Russia and not vice versa. George Orwell would turn in his grave. As noted by USG DiCarlo, all these baseless claims of alleged Russian victims cannot be verified. So my response to you is very simple, and I would say it in Russian. Прекратите ныть и лгать. И просто убирайтесь из Украины. Just stop whining and lying and get out of Ukraine. Mr. President, we are all closely following the disturbing developments in the Middle East. Ukraine expresses its condolences to the victims of Iran's missile and drone attacks against the countries in the region and deeply deplores these treacherous strikes. That is why Ukraine became one of the first co-sponsors of the Security Council Resolution 2817, adopted 2 weeks ago, condemning these attacks against the Gulf countries and Jordan. Moreover, our solidarity was not just words. In the very first days, Ukraine sent hundreds of experts who are already on the ground helping our partners in the region to counter aerial threats and intercept deadly Iranian drones. Mr. President, even though Russia did not dare to veto this resolution, what we have seen in the last weeks is that it is Moscow that has been providing substantial military support to the Tehran regime. It is Russia that is not just the principal ally of Iran, but the main accomplice and co-perpetrator of unlawful attacks against civilian infrastructure of the Gulf states. Russia has long portrayed itself as a big friend of the global South, opposing the vicious West, but this narrative collapses under the weight of the real actions of Moscow, helping Iran to ruin oil and gas production facilities in the region. Russia does not care about the global South. It has actually betrayed it. The Kremlin is not just providing Tehran with intelligence support, including satellite imagery and other crucial data that facilitate targeting of US military assets across the Middle East. There is, moreover, enough evidence that Russia is now transferring modernized Shahed-type drones to Iran, drawing on its own production capabilities based on licensed Iranian designs. The same Shahed drones that Tehran was sending to Moscow since the beginning of the war, 2022, to murder Ukrainian civilians are now produced in Russia and sent back both to destroy oil and gas infrastructure as the backbone of the economy in the Gulf state and to kill American soldiers. This is an unprecedented escalation in the region that may cost countless lives. Earlier this year, Russia reportedly transferred attack helicopters to Iran in apparent violation of relevant UN arms restrictions. But the massive production of Russian drones and the provision to the Tehran regime elevates this conspiracy to a new level. Mr. President, this axis of evil between Moscow and Tehran constitutes an enormous threat to international security. Their military cooperation is truly alarming. The United States and the international community must take this threat seriously and act before it is too late. With those Russian drones, the Tehran regime will be capable of waging this war for a very long period, destabilizing not just the region, but the whole global economy. This means that production sites of Russian drones should be considered legitimate targets for military strikes in the campaign against the mullah regime. Ukraine is already contributing to the weakening of the military potential of Moscow-Tehran unholy alliance, as our troops are hitting these production facilities, exercising the right of self-defense. So providing Ukraine with the means for deep strikes and helping ramp up our domestic production of long-range missiles would support collective efforts to bring peace to the Middle East. And my last point on Russia's hidden role in destabilizing the whole region. In reality, Russia is the primary beneficiary of the new wave of instability in the Middle East. First, it automatically diverts global attention away from its ongoing aggression against Ukraine. Second, the massive deployment of air defense systems is already creating shortages on the international markets. And third, and most critically, rising oil and gas prices are generating extraordinary windfall revenues for Russia. Estimates suggest that in March alone, Russia may earn an additional $10 billion from energy exports. That is why we call upon our allies to impose additional sanctions on Russian oil and gas to deprive Moscow of these profits that fuel not only its war against Ukraine, but also undermine global security and claim lives, including those of American servicemen. Mr. President, while the world's attention shifts, we must not allow Russia's war against Ukraine to be overshadowed and to fade into the background. The recent conflict in Iran has revealed how intertwined this crisis is with Russia's military invasion and the Kremlin's malign imperialistic goals. There shall be no illusion. This Russian war of annihilation against Ukrainian statehood continues with relentless brutality. This winter was the deadliest for the civilian population since February 22. Over the last 3 months alone, Russia launched nearly 19,000 strike drones, more than 14,600 guided bombs, and around 800 missiles. Russia sought to plunge Ukraine into total blackout, to fully destroy our critical infrastructure and break the resistance of our people. But even though the suffering of civilians and the level of devastation are huge, Russia has failed to achieve this perfidious goal. According to recent polls, Ukrainians do not even consider giving up. I will translate it into Russian language again. Не дождетесь. Don't hold your breath. Mr. President, what we are witnessing is a carefully staged performance that Russia continues to play. On the one hand, the war situation for the Kremlin is increasingly bleak on the battlefield, and yet Moscow keeps on puffing up its greatness, pretending to be invincible and projecting the image of being one step away from total victory and Ukraine's supposed capitulation. As the Institute for the Study of War, an independent think tank, rightly pointed out a few days ago, Putin's negotiating position is based on a bluff and a lie. The bluff is that the Russians will overwhelm Ukraine and take what they want anyway, and the lie is that Mr. Putin will be satisfied with less than what he continually demands, namely a de facto surrender of Ukraine. This Russian claim of inevitability of its triumph is a myth, and I will briefly explain why. Russia has failed to achieve any of the goals of its full-scale military invasion. We are dealing with the longest three-day blitzkrieg in human history, dragging on for over 4 years now. Let us take a closer look at the situation on the front line. Russian forces occupy now 19.4% of Ukrainian territory. They had taken about 7% during the first phase of the war, back in 2014, and came to occupy a total of 26.8% shortly after the full-scale invasion began in 22. Subsequent Ukrainian counteroffensives left the Russians holding only about 17.9% of Ukrainian soil in November 22. So, since then, since autumn 22, Russia has seized only 1.5% more Ukrainian land while suffering over 1.2 million casualties in total. Just think about it for a moment. Russian troops, the self-proclaimed second army in the world, have needed 3.5 years to occupy 9,300 square kilometers, an area 3 times the size of Rhode Island. Putin's allegedly inexorable march to victory has been proceeding more slowly than a turtle's pace, and at the current speed, it would take 183 years to occupy the whole territory of Ukraine. I repeat, Russia will need 183 years. It doesn't really sound like a successful blitzkrieg for Moscow, does it? That is exactly the reason why Putin demands that Ukraine abandon, without a fight, territories in the Donetsk region that Moscow have failed to occupy over 12 years of its aggression. By turning such ultimatums into preconditions for negotiations, as we have seen, Russia is deliberately obstructing the peace process. That is one of the biggest stumbling blocks on the way to a peaceful resolution. Russia has simultaneously invented other unresolvable dilemmas, both demanding that Ukraine hold elections as a condition for a final peace settlement, while refusing at the same time the ceasefire which is needed for such elections. Russia must stop playing these games. We call upon the United States as a mediator, as the only mediator, to make clear to the Russians that these tricks are doomed to fail. By the way, in the last months, Ukrainian troops have broken the dynamics of war and begun to push Russian forces back. In February alone, the Ukrainian army liberated a territory the combined size of Queens and Brooklyn in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. So from the military point of view, Russia is not winning the war, and it is an obvious fact. The second reason why Putin is failing in Ukraine is because of the deteriorating economic situation in Russia that I described in detail when I was honored to speak before this council last time in January. This Monday, even Putin himself, with a visibly subdued expression, acknowledged the grave state of Russia's economy. Just watch this video to see his long face. It is priceless. Zero growth, zero reserves, increasing budget deficit, and many other factors make more and more difficult for Russia to finance the war against Ukraine and pay the salary to its soldiers. The war in Iran and growing prices for oil and gas can, however, become a saving grace and a new lifeline for the Russian war machinery. Putin will be clutching at straws, trying to use this chaos in the Middle East as a game changer. We cannot allow it to happen. Thus, we appeal to our friends, to our allies, to the United States to reintroduce sanctions against Russian energy resources as soon as possible and tighten the screws on Moscow. We also call upon other member states who used to be the biggest buyers of Russian oil and gas and diesel to stop exporting them and stop filling Kremlin's war chest and bankrolling its aggression. Mr. President, the only domain in which Russia is regrettably succeeding is in inflicting suffering to the Ukrainian people. Every day civilians are murdered both in areas near the front lines and deep within Ukraine as a result of daily drone and missile attacks. We have just heard the shocking figures of the numbers of victims during the briefing of USG DiCarlo. I will not repeat them. They still echo in our ears. The medieval era brutality that we see as Russia wages this war against Ukraine must be stopped. Mr. President, irrespective of all Russian tricks, abusing diplomacy as a tool of delay aimed at gambling on reduced international support for Kiev, we remain fully committed to the restoration of peace. Ukraine never was and will never be an obstacle to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. We will spare no efforts to continue negotiations under the US leadership towards this goal. Mr. President, before I wrap up, allow me to address one final point. At our previous meeting, the representative of Russia once again recycled a familiar narrative about an alleged historical unity between Ukrainians and Russians. He even muttered something about Kievan Rus under his breath that we Ukrainians had sold for 30 pieces of silver. Let me set the historical record straight once and for all. In the beginning of the 12th century, Kiev was the capital of the largest and one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe. In those times, the area of present-day Moscow was nothing more than a swamp where only frogs were croaking. It was in 1147 that a tiny settlement on the edge of the known political world was first mentioned that later would develop into Moscow. And it was under the powerful reign of the Grand Princess of Kiev that Moscow was founded. And then it was Andrei Boголюbsky, the ruler of Vladimir Suzdal, today's Russia, whose troops plundered Kiev back in 1169, murdered its citizens, and looted the city's treasures with a ferocity which is reminiscent of the barbarian sackings of ancient Rome. So let us be honest, it was Moscow that betrayed Kiev. It is Moscow that continues the same brutal policy to this day, bombing Kiev, destroying our Golden Dome churches, raping and killing civilians. So, I would like to address our Russian colleagues. Ukrainians do not need your distorted historical lessons about imagined unity. It's like they're lecturing the chicken. At the cradle of the Ukrainian statehood, Kiev had stood firm for more than 1,000 years, and it will stand for 1,000 more. It will flourish, it will be unconquered, and Russia will fail to subjugate it. So let me address you again in your own language that serves as a reminder of Russian colonial legacy. Закончен бал, потухли свечи. Бери шинель, иди домой. The carnival is over, the candles are out. Take your trench coats and get out of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
President, I'm making this statement on behalf of the three Baltic states. And let me start by thanking the briefers, USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher, for their valuable inputs to this timely Security Council briefing today. Just last month, we marked the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale aggression. However, Russia's war against Ukraine did not begin then. This month marks 12 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, following an illegal and illegitimate so-called referendum, as well as the start of Russia's armed aggression in eastern Ukraine. More than 12 years ago, Russia's killing of innocent Ukrainian civilians began, unlawfully and indiscriminately. Since then, it has not stopped. According to the United Nations, more than 15,000 civilians have been killed and over 41,000 injured in Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. The true toll is undoubtedly higher, including victims since March 2014, the full extent of which remains unclear. Russia's killings continues. These attacks target civilians and civilian infrastructure, and they are clear violation of international humanitarian law and cannot be justified or explained under any circumstances. This killing has come at a significant cost for Russia. According to publicly available sources, Russia's battlefield losses are estimated at approximately 1,315,000 soldiers since the start of its full-scale invasion in 2022, including both killed and seriously wounded. Even these figures likely underestimate the true staggering scale of Russia's losses. However, Russia has not lost only soldiers and military equipment. It has also lost credibility, honor, and international standing. Russia's aggression is totally incompatible not only with the status and responsibilities of a permanent member of the Security Council, but also with those of any United Nations member states. Its full-scale aggression against Ukraine constitutes one of the most serious violations of the United Nations Charter and international law, amounting to the crime of aggression and accompanied by widespread war crimes. It represents the gravest threat to European and global security since the Second World War. We call on all states to support and join the initiative to establish a special tribunal on the crime of aggression as a necessary step to reinforce the international law-based multilateral system and ensure that impunity does not prevail. Less than 2 weeks ago, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the United Nations Human Rights Council, published a deeply disturbing report concluding that the systematic deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children by Russian authorities may amount to crimes against humanity. The continuation of this war depends solely on Russia's choices. It can cease its military actions immediately and engage in genuine good faith negotiations focused on the full withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, compensation for the damage caused, and accountability for those responsible, rather than the insincere processes we have seen for far too long. President, we must collectively apply maximum pressure on Russia to end its aggression and engage in a just and lasting peace. This must be grounded in the UN Charter and international law, including the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The occupation of any part of Ukraine will never be recognized by the international community. The Baltic states stand firmly with Ukraine because defending Ukraine means defending the ironclad principles of the UN Charter, including sovereign equality of states, as well as the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Allow me to begin by thanking you, Mr. President, and the U.S. Presidency for convening this meeting, and also warm thanks to Undersecretary Generals DiCarlo and Fletcher for their important, even if chilling, updates. Russia's disastrous war of aggression has now entered its 5th year. Almost 1,500 days have passed in which Russia has subjected Ukraine and its citizens to a brutal aggression, a violation of the UN Charter which has repeatedly been condemned by the UN General Assembly. But Russia's statement in this chamber continued to blame others and to float incredible, often self-contradictory justifications for the unjustifiable. Colleagues, we rarely hear about the toll of this war on Russians themselves. Russia's leaders would certainly not want their citizens to know. Its forces have reportedly suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties since 2022, with as many as 325,000 killed. What a staggering lack of respect for human life And yet, it has not achieved its military objectives and struggles to hold the territory it has captured. And frustrated by its lack of progress on the battleground, Russia continues to deliberately target Ukrainian civilians. That's an easier target, isn't it? Their energy, their heating, their water, their hospitals, their schools, their residences, their lives. In February alone, Russia targeted Ukrainian cities with almost 300 missiles and over 5,000 drones. The highest numbers, I stress, since it started a systematic campaign against Ukrainian civilians 4 years ago. The OHCHR has verified at least 188 civilian deaths in February as a result of Russia's attacks, adding to the over 15,000 verified civilian deaths Russia is responsible for. Without the successful interception rate of Ukrainian air defenses, civilian casualties would have been even higher. Intentionally attacking civilians and civilian objects is a war crime, as if anyone needed to remind this in this chamber, and perpetrators will face justice and will be held accountable. We commend the resilience of the Ukrainian people to stand firm in defense of their country and stand up for the UN Charter. Colleagues, according to UNICEF, over a third of Ukrainian children remain displaced as a result of Russia's aggression. I recall the decision of the General Assembly last December to redouble efforts to return Ukrainian children who have been unlawfully deported and forcibly transferred to Russia, and we look forward to hearing from the UN about its efforts to this end. For those still in doubt about whether this is important, I refer to the comprehensive new report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry that presents further damning evidence of Russia's obstruction of the return of Ukrainian children. The Commission concludes that Russia's actions amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. The Commission concludes that. We're also deeply alarmed by its findings that nationals from Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia are recruited by Russia to fight in Ukraine, often lured by false pretenses. Colleagues, in coordination with our allies, the European Union will continue to provide comprehensive political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people in line with their inherent right to self-defense, according to Article 51 of the UN Charter. At the same time, the European Union continues to focus on achieving an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with international law, including the UN Charter. The General Assembly has spoken out very clearly in this regard, very recently in this regard. The EU will sustain its diplomatic efforts with Ukraine, together with the United States and other partners. From its side, Ukraine has repeatedly stated its readiness for an immediate ceasefire. Meanwhile, Russia continues to pursue its maximalist tactics and claims. We call on all members of this Council to join us in urging Russia, indeed, in supplying sustained diplomatic pressure on Russia to stop pretending and to engage in meaningful negotiations. Third countries that enable Russia's aggression must also stop doing so. Iran, Belarus, the DPRK must halt the military support, and all countries, including members of this Council, must cease any and all direct and indirect assistance to Russia. We welcome Ukraine's readiness to provide support and expertise in air defense and counter-drone systems to Gulf countries. This is based, of course, on its own experience of being systematically subjected to Russian attacks by Iranian Shahed drones. President, in conclusion, I reiterate the European Union's support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. No country can annex its neighbor. No borders can be changed by force. It is time for Russia to stop the killing and engage in meaningful talks in order to achieve a just and lasting peace. Enough is enough. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lambrinidis, for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to join the others in thanking Undersecretary General Di Carlo and Undersecretary General Fletcher for their very important briefings today. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine is continuing for the 5th year with the publicly and openly declared intention to grab territory from an independent neighboring country and annex it for good. The war has resulted in over 15,000 civilian deaths, not to mention the total human toll and economic and environmental costs of the invasion, some of them global. All this destruction caused by unlawful invasion, as pointless as it was over 4 years ago. The Nordic countries have stated this before, and I reiterate. The Russian Federation could end this war today simply by calling its troops home. We regret that the political will to stop the aggression is still lacking after more than 4 years. Mr. President, despite this grim backdrop, there is ground for hope. First, Russia's war of aggression is not progressing according to the aggressor's plans. What was initially portrayed as a 3-day operation has now lasted for over 4 years. Russia has lost a staggering amount of both personnel and military material. At the same time, the Ukrainian resilience has remained remarkable. The invading Russian troops have been stalled, even pushed back in some parts of the front line. It is obvious that Russia is failing to meet its objectives on the battleground. Second, there have been several serious initiatives to promote peace. These discussions need to continue and gain momentum. The Nordic countries appreciate all the good efforts made by the United States and others in this regard. Regrettably, we are yet to see the Russian Federation engage in a genuine and meaningful manner. Third, significant progress has been made to establish a robust accountability framework. International courts and tribunals are playing a substantial role, with ICC investigations and ICJ proceedings moving forward. The Nordic countries are committed to the ongoing work of the Register of Damage for Ukraine and stand firmly behind the establishment of the Claims Commission and the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Fourth, spring is coming. Ukrainians have made it through another gruesome winter, battling the bitter freezing cold that is caused by Russia's attacks against energy infrastructure. Intentional attacks against civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities, amount to war crimes. A clear objective behind Russia's unlawful means and methods of warfare is to overcome Ukraine's civilian resilience. Yet again, Ukraine has prevailed. Furthermore, Ukraine's international partners are there to support it in preparing also for the next winter. Russia, as one of the 5 permanent members of this Council, has a particular responsibility to uphold the UN Charter and its core principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence. Instead, Russia continues to blatantly violate the UN Charter and its core principles. In closing, Mr. President, the Nordic countries reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine and for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with international law, including the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Finland for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, at the outset, I thank the United States of America and you personally for convening this meeting, and the briefers, the USG Di Carlo and Tom Fletcher, for their informative interventions. Mr. President, the brave Ukrainian society endured a very harsh winter while Russia fiercely attacked civilians and the critical infrastructure. The humanitarian situation, although, remains critical, as we heard. During the most freezing temperatures, the Polish authorities and the NGOs sent hundreds of power generators to Kiev and other cities to alleviate this huge humanitarian crisis. This is our concrete effort you ask for, alongside with hosting the more than 1 million of the Ukrainian refugees in Poland, to buy peace, to bring peace to this war. Because there will be no peace unless the Ukraine and Ukrainians will survive and will be saved from this aggression. Because there's only one aggressor and one victim. While global attention has partially shifted due to the crisis in the Middle East, the intensity of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has not diminished. We are aware that Russia is attempting to exploit the situation and to advance its own agenda. The drones currently striking the Gulf countries are very much the same as the one that's supplied by Iran to Russia and vice versa for use on its aggression against Ukraine. States of both regions should clearly see that, and that Russia and Iran share a strategy characterized by aggressive stance and unprovoked indiscriminate attacks against their neighbors, including strikes targeting residential areas and civilian infrastructure. Their conduct deserves the condemnation of the international community. Mr. President, in Ukraine, with improving weather conditions, further escalation along the front line can be expected. Drones and missiles continue to target civilian infrastructure as part of Russia's war of attrition. And Moscow does not stop there. Poland has observed a campaign organized by Russia to recruit individuals from Africa who are subsequently deployed to the front lines against Ukraine. In many cases, these individuals are unaware that they will be participating directly in the hostilities. Russia is exploiting vulnerable populations from different regions around the world, often taking advantage of their difficult economic conditions by offering deceptive employment opportunities. These people and their families are becoming victims of Moscow's policy, which is an example of the worst neo-colonial practices. Mr. President, recalling the historic session of this Council, chaired by the US First Lady and devoted to the crisis facing children in war zones, we wish to condemn the grave violations of the children's rights caused by Russia's aggression. Hundreds of children have been killed, thousands injured, and many forcibly displaced, often separated from their families. Repeated disruptions to education are having long-term consequences for an entire generation. Particularly alarming are the unfair transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children, which we firmly condemn and call to be immediately revised and reversed. Mr. President, Poland supports peace efforts. However, it must be noted that while Ukraine has demonstrated readiness to pursue diplomatic solutions, Russia has shown no credible willingness to engage in meaningful negotiations and continues to escalate hostilities. Therefore, we must remain united in providing comprehensive support to Ukraine, including military and financial assistance, while increasing pressure on Russia. We call for further means targeting Russia's war economy and for additional measures to restrict the shadow fleet, which provides critical revenue to the Russian budget. Mr. President, to conclude, to break the Russian pattern of aggression, we need to ensure full accountability for all violations of international law committed in Ukraine. Those responsible must be brought to justice, and impunity cannot be allowed to prevail. We need unity within the international community, including with this Council, in upholding the principles of the UN Charter. Any path to peace must be based on a full respect for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within these internationally recognized borders. Poland reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine and its people. We call for sustained international support and safe, unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need. We will stand in solidarity with Ukraine, as you know, solidarity means a lot to Poles. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. those attacks, yet we still have not gotten the results of the investigation. Attacks are also continuing on other export infrastructure, which supplies Russian gas via Turkstream and Bluestream. In the last few days alone, there were drone attacks attempted on the Ruskaya compressor station in the Krasnodarsk region, as well as Kazachia and Verogovaya stations. These irresponsible actions are occurring at a time when global energy markets are acutely unstable, not to mention
needed 3.5 years.
Mr. President, Poland supports peace efforts. However, it must be noted while
abducting thousands of children from the temporarily occupied territories. While some children have been returned, these successes only follow tireless Ukrainian and international pressure. As the Commission's report makes clear, 80% of documented deported children remain separated from their loved ones after more than 4 years. Denmark renews its demand for the immediate implementation of the December 2025 General Assembly resolution called the Return of Ukrainian Children. Children must never be pawns in war. They must be identified, traced, and returned safely to their families. We've seen too few credible signs from the Russian Federation that it is working to implement this resolution. Those responsible for these horrendous crimes must be held fully accountable. Third, Mr. President, the Russian military has reportedly already sustained more than 1.2 million casualties in this senseless war. The Kremlin is now increasingly and desperately turning to other countries for manpower. Recent media reports detail over 1,000 men from Africa who were tricked into fighting in Russia's illegal war. This shows the global dangers of Putin's war of choice.